Hey everyone, welcome back to Making the Game from concept to Kickstarter. In this podcast, I, Reece, the lead game designer for the game Bloodthrone, discuss the process of going from tabletop gaming idea through the development cycle to crowdfunding, production, fulfillment, and more. Bloodthrone is still available to be backed into Pledge Manager via Gamefound for anyone interested. And in this episode number 11, we will discuss the PvE campaign in the Bloodthrone core box as asked by backer BloodThroneEnthusiast on Gamefound. Before we do that, I will bring you an update on the current state of development. We are currently finalizing the token cut sheets, so those are the sheets that go to the press that's going to punch them out, so that when you get the boards and you pop out all the tokens, we have to design that. There are hundreds or over 400 tokens in Bloodthrone to be specific. And we did that to make it as easy as possible to stay organized during the play of the game. There's more tokens than we strictly needed, but we wanted every single character to have color-coordinated tokens you put in the box for the character. So once it's set up, playing the game is going to be a lot easier. Like a lot of games, setting it up and breaking it down is a major pain in the tuchus. Once Bloodthrone is set up, it should be relatively easy to open it up and get going once you get over the hump initially. So that said, trying to put, over 400 tokens of varying sizes and shapes and basically playing Tetris to get them to fit on these boards, and the boards have to be this specific size, not only to fit in the box, but then to fit within the machine's parameters. Just as with everything that we've done in our first go, it's been a challenge, but it's been a fun and interesting learning experience. So we're almost there. And the reason that we shifted our focus to that was we need to have the tokens in order to get the organizer trays designed, because the factory needs to see how many and what kind of tokens and what shapes they are to design the spaces in the tray that hold them. And the trays can take a while to design. Found out they could take up to 6 weeks, so that was a bit of a shock. Again, it's not terrible or anything like that. It's just it's pushing us back very slightly from our schedule. But again, this is a learning experience, right? This is why you have to do something for the first time every time, and then going forward, we'll know to plan some of these things out better to avoid some of these delays. But again, we're talking about a very probably a 2-week delay, not like 6 months or something like you see in other Kickstarters. So we're almost done with that. The tokens are all designed. We've just been moving them around to try and make sure that they fit on these cut sheets. And right now, the only fly in the ointment is that we have one component that's bigger than in one dimension, it's bigger than one of the sheets. So we're trying to figure out what to do with that. So we may end up making it out of another material. It's the longer measuring widget. It's like slightly longer than the X or Y dimension of the cut sheet, but it needs to be the length it is for game purposes. So we'll get that resolved relatively quickly. I'm sure it's not that complex of an issue. The first rulebook is in the layout process. Finally, gosh, that took me so much longer than I thought. I've never made a book. I've never made a book with tons of graphics and references, like see this page to see the definition of this rule and doing the index and all that. It took longer than anticipated. None of it's particularly hard, really. It's just new, right? And it's complex, but it's looking really good. And we got the hero sheets. So think like your character sheet if you're playing D&D. In the workbook for Bloodthrone, we have hero sheets, which is where you track all the nuts and bolts of leveling your character. It's like an expanded version of the hero boards. The hero boards are the colorful ones with their tokens. They're modular that you see in the videos and the pictures. The hero board is what you use when you're playing, so you're not overwhelmed with information. It's not like having 6 D&D character sheets in front of you. It's just what you need. And they're modular, so as you level up, you can put some of the tokens in to increase your HP or whatever the case may be, your movement, whatever. The hero sheet is what has everything, right? And then the way we design them is it tells you how to level the character up as well. So when you're in that process, when you level up, it's got all your options. Oh, so at level 2, these are all the feats I can select from, and then you just bubble it in. I pick this one, and then it tells you what to do. It's like, okay, now, go increase the stat by this much. So Makes it super easy. Obviously, the app will do this too, but we wanted the game to be able to be played analog without needing the app. So we got that. All the data is already done, obviously, but designing it in a way that looked nice took a little bit longer than anticipated. But now that we have the template, we should be able to just crush through those really quickly. So that's all good. The last molds are being done, as I've said before. It's a long process, but those will be done this month. And on a personal note, I'm getting married on Friday of next week. So I'm leaving on Monday, the 5th of August. So, excuse me. Realistically, I'm not going to be able to answer too many questions and stuff on the pledge managers and things like that. So just bear with me. I'll be back on the 12th of August, but the rest of the team has their marching orders, and they'll be working on finishing up all the cards with the art and all that sort of stuff. And as of today, the last of the 2D art assets from the art studio that we work with were finished. I literally got them this morning. They look really, really good. That's another interesting one. That'll be a podcast. It'll probably be multiple podcasts. Is if you're not familiar with art design and art direction and all that sort of stuff, like it's much more complicated than I thought it would be, right? Like, if you want to make sure that you plan it out really carefully in advance. The hard part for us was actually finding reliable artists that didn't have like utterly absurd prices. Like some of these artists, I don't understand how they can consistently get work. Like some of them are good, but like they're not, amazing, but they're like, oh, it's, thousands of dollars per image. And I'm like, I need like 20 images, it's like that. I was like, that would cost more than the molds for the models. So, I think a lot of them, especially the contract artists, they price themselves based on like doing one piece or two pieces. And then you'll talk to like some of the professional artists, like studio artists, and it's, it's a different, like you pay them a retainer and like I can produce X amount of work per month and things of that nature. It's a complex topic. And then a lot of the independent artists, like they don't hit their deadlines or the work isn't good and then they don't want to do revisions. It was a challenge, right? So we eventually just hired a studio, a professional studio, and while they're not cheap, like compared to what some of these independents were trying to charge per piece, it's much, much more realistic. It's consistent. You book them out for months in advance. They stick to the schedule. If they go over on time, they don't charge you for it because you already have a contract that you agreed. It's just infinitely better in my experience to work with a studio. I think if you need to produce a lot of art, that you want to go in, find a studio like we did, or find a very professional independent contractor, make everything as crystal clear as possible, make sure you know what you want in advance as best as you can, and then sign a contract out for an extended period of time. Because for them, it helps as well to be able to plan out their income, right? Like they want to know that they've got reliable income for the next, 3 to 4 months or whatever the case may be. So at any rate, I digress. We'll dive more into that in the future, but suffice it to say, and I don't mean to be negative either. There's tons of great artists out there, and we worked with some really good independent artists, but it's from where I'm standing at this point in the game, it's better to book a studio or a very professional independent artist and to block out a large period of time. Because we found one artist that was great. His prices were in the range of reasonable. And then we came back to book him again, but he was booked out for the rest of the year. So, lots to talk about on that. But the art really brings it to life, and it's one of the coolest parts of it. So definitely important. Anyway, BloodThrone, to get back on topic, BloodThrone, how does the campaign play? So I covered part of this in one of the very first podcasts, but we'll go over it again just to answer the question from BloodThroneEnthusiast backer. So BloodThrone provides you an RPG in a box experience. So imagine playing a fantastic campaign in a game like D&D or whatever Pathfinder, whatever RPG that you're familiar with, and having a DM that spent weeks and weeks in preparation to make a really cool campaign, had everything planned out. So with an RPG in a box style experience like BloodThrone, you can just open the box and get going. We try to make it as easy as possible to just roll right into it. Like the miniatures are pre-assembled. The terrain is really easy to put together. You basically pop it into place, do a little bit of like tuck folding. You're ready to rock. The rule book, the rule section is longer than in some games, but I wanted to be very thorough. I put in lots of examples. There's lots of diagrams. And really all you need is the quick play guide, right? You pop that thing open and you can really just get going. It tells you like punch out these tokens for the first 3 heroes and off you're running. So again, it is a complex game, but we tried to make it as simple as possible to get rolling. And there's other similar games on the market that are in the same vein in terms of like overall concept, like Gloomhaven, Kingdom Death, Descent, any number of games in that vein, right? They're similar in concept. BloodThrone is different from those in terms of theme and mechanics, but the broader concept, like the general concept, is very similar. So mechanically, the campaign, it's most similar to the video game series XCOM, especially XCOM 2. For anybody that's familiar with it, if you're not familiar with it, you can just look it up if you're curious. It's an extremely popular video game, so I'm sure most people listening to this have at least heard of it. But the campaign plays most similarly to the way the campaigns in XCOM plays. And what I mean by that, no, there's not aliens and laser guns and things of this nature. Mechanically, the way the campaign in XCOM goes is it is a race against time. So you're trying to take your team of what start out as like kind of scrubs, although heroes in BloodThrone start out pretty good. That was a design choice we made, which I've talked about. And you're trying to build up your resources to fight this battle against overwhelming odds against a superior force. You're getting better, you're managing your team, and it's a race against time, right? Like you're constantly losing. You have to keep pushing forward to win, if that makes sense. I'll explain that in more depth as we go. But that game, which I think is a masterpiece, was a big inspiration for the structure of the campaign in the core box. Now, thematically, obviously, BloodThrone is going to be a lot different. It's fantasy. It's dark fantasy. The themes are not happy and fun. You know, it's basically a war to save the planet and the souls of all the people on the planet. So it's pretty dark thematically, although it's not, you know, Berserk level dark, although I love Berserk. It is not meant to be as lighthearted as oftentimes you'll see in like D&D, for example. So you have to select the right missions. You have to select the right upgrades. You have to build your base out the correct way. I'll explain that in a little bit. You have to avoid the bad guys from conquering the world and even the afterlife. So the stakes are high. The lore is really good, and I'll cover that very briefly here. So that's it. The campaign centers around what the title says. It's the Tower of Sacrifice. So the name of the overall game is BloodThrone. This individual game is called the Tower of Sacrifice. What that is referring to is the big bad guy in the core box. His name is Belphegor. He has a crawling tower. The crawling towers are these mobile, magical, you know, wizard's towers, basically. Like, they're more complex than that. But for now, that'll give you an idea. And from these, the most powerful bad guys on the planet, they project their power out of it. So Belphegor, his tower is in the location of the game, and he's attempting to become a new overgod. And I'll explain that again very briefly. No crawling tower has ever been defeated or even close to being defeated. So what you're attempting to do is kind of crazy in lore terms. So we'll dive into that now. Why do you care about what Belphegor is doing? Why do you care about his Tower of Sacrifice? Why do you care about any of this? So I've covered the lore before, but just to give it a recap to contextualize the campaign and hopefully get people excited, because I think the lore is really, really good. It's very, very fleshed out. We've been working on it for years. So the remaining nations of the world of Chael, which is the name of the world, have organized into a force to prevent disaster. This group, this team up, is called the Last Accord. The Accords are an important part of the lore, and they'll be explored in depth in the core book, and especially in the hero expansion. We really dive into it. But in short, the goddess of creation, Zenith, she was the original over-goddess, and she was in the beginning for our world. She was the only being in creation. So as Zenith is going through the process of creating the universe and life, she lays out the Accords as guidelines for sentient life on the world of Chael. So Zenith was killed by her consort, Hasathan, who's the god of endings, of destruction. He's the yin to her yang. And that set off the disastrous Throne Wars, which was the major event that precedes the current game state. So Hatasan was also killed in the course of this cataclysmic conflict, leaving the world of Chael without any overgods. And again, that's why in the promotional material we say the gods are dead or God is dead, to reflect that the heavens are empty in this game world, which is obviously a cause of major anxiety in a world where the gods were very real and involved in the people's lives. So now each nation does have a patron deity. It's like a demigod. We call them devas in the game. And each deva helps guide their people. And in return, they are sustained by the worship of the people in their faction or in their nation. Not all of them are organized in a traditional nation state as we would think of one, but their faction, basically. So the worship, the willful giving of Zenithé, which is the life essence which comes from Zenith, goes back to these devas and is what keeps the deva sustained. So it's a symbiotic relationship. The deva will then in return channel bursts of Zenithé back into the champions of their people, and that's how a wizard shoots a fireball, or a barbarian can like scream so hard that he heals himself. These metaphysical or supernatural abilities in our game, that's how we explain them. That's how they work. It's basically like Goku throwing a spirit bomb. He's like, everybody give me your power. So it's like that, where the devas, the demigods, are like the intermediary, right? So as long as the deva is guiding their people in a good direction, people will then reward them with worship, which is like food. It's like manna for the gods, the devas, and then the devas will then, as they deem fit, they'll channel that power from the people back into the champions, who then use it to perform amazing feats. So Zenith set up this system in order to ensure that, one, the devas are acting in the best interest of their people. They're not just being lazy, corrupt, lame gods. Like I love mythology, and I always loved stories about like the Greek gods or the Norse gods. They would act like people. They'd be petty and lame and cruel, and our devas can do that too. But the difference is they literally need their people to venerate them, or they will die, right? Which is kind of true of gods in the real world too. Like not very many people or anyone is thinking too much or praying to Zeus, for example. I'm sure there are some people. So it's kind of a reflection of that in allegorical, or where it would be allegorical in our world, it would be very real in the world of Chael. Now, as a part of sustaining this cycle, living things have to eventually pass away in order for the Zenithé within them to go back into the cycle, right? So the Accords, part of the Accords, it's like kind of the 10 Commandments of our world, but as it pertains to what we're describing right now, the Accords dictate that no living creature can have a life, or no sentient being, not like trees and a sea tortoise or whatever. We're talking about sentient beings that engage in this cycle. They worship a god and are protected and energized by the Deva. They can't. There's a mandate that they can't live longer than 120 years, right? So that cycle keeps things fresh, keeps things from stagnating, it keeps things from descending into entropy. It makes sure that life is moving forward. That was all part of Zenith's plan for the nature of the way the divine and the mortal were to interact with and function together. So they're always moving forward and improving. Now, Hasatan, who ostensibly is Zenith's equal, although she initially was dramatically more powerful, and every time she created something, she would give up some of her own Zenithé in order to create it. So she obviously put an enormous amount into Hasatan to create her consort. He is in charge of the endings of things. However, Hasatan didn't choose this. He was created. And even though she treats him as his equal, he there's like a seed of resentment that's in his heart, because he didn't choose to be the god of destruction and endings and death. He doesn't even necessarily enjoy his role. And he has a father's love for the children that they create together. So sentient life came from Zenith and Hasatan. together, and his job was to cut the cord, right? If we're talking about Norse mythology, the Norns know your fate. He's the one that's cutting the cord. And over time, he started to come to resent it. He didn't enjoy that part of his role. Now, additionally, without going too much into the lore, the Devas came later. So the sentient beings were first. They started doing all kinds of bad, terrible, nasty things to each other, which we are all too aware of, being fallible humans and reading the news. So Zenith decided to create the Devas in order to have a more personal relationship with the sentient beings to help guide them, right? And that's how all the factions of the world came into being. Hasatan didn't really like this. So for one, he felt that the two of them could guide their mortal children. And then it was a further diminishment of Zenith when she created the Devas, because it was obviously took a ton of the resource, which is essentially her. And then it also took a lot of her attention away. So he didn't like that either. He had a bit of a jilted lover syndrome, so to speak. So this resentment grew and grew. He kept appealing to her, like, hey, like, can we change the Accords or get rid of the Accords? Maybe some of our children do deserve to live longer. Maybe, and these Devas are annoying and they're squabbling with each other, and I don't agree with everything that they're doing. So it became a major point of contention, which ultimately culminated in, his frustration and anger grew to the point where he eventually killed her, and he was only able to kill her because she kept giving so much of herself that she became weaker. So at this point, Hasatan, he's going through a major crisis, like psychologically and everything else. He tries to enter the mortal plane. It drives him a little nuts. Can't quite pull it off, but he keeps trying to do it. And as a part of this, him kind of reconcile himself with what he's done. He can't believe it. He kind of goes all in. He puts all his chips on the table on team not so good guy. He then shows his faction on Cheo how to extract Zenithae forcefully against someone's will from them through their blood. That's called Devathae. And then it's like a drug. The people that his followers that use it gained unholy, unnatural vitality and power. But the weak-willed amongst them, it warps their mind, it warps their body even, turns them into monsters. That's where a lot of the monsters in the world of Cheo come from. They used to be people or sentient beings that got twisted, and a lot of them go mad, and the substance is terribly addicting. So a lot of them, all they can think about is getting more of it. But unfortunately, it comes at the existence of another being. So it's an inherently evil substance, but it's also inherently powerful. So the immortal host goes on a rampage, destroying everything. Hasatan's insane with grief, anger, guilt, all these feelings. He's pissed. The entire world rallies to stop him, and this is what triggers the Throne Wars, right? It's a world war on the world of Cheo. It's everyone versus Hasatan and his wild horde. It's a great story. I won't go too far into it, but eventually, at great cost, Hasatan is killed. So now there's no overgods. Basically, heaven is empty. And Hasatan's Valtaria is like a human champion. Or not human, I'm sorry. It's just a sentient being that is a champion on the mortal plane that has a direct connection to the Deva. So it's a thing of like Hercules or Achilles or, any of these sort of almost demigod-like figures that exist on the mortal plane. They're like they're like the mortal champion of their faction, which was going to be super cool for like amazing models and art and all kinds of stuff as we explore that. But Kerioth, who is Hasatan's champion, it's a cool story. I won't give up too much of it. He ascends to take the place that Hasatan left behind. He becomes a living god, except he exists in the physical plane. So now the world of Cheo went from the frying pan into the fire. So instead of having the god of destruction in the metaphysical plane leading an insane horde of berserk mutant warriors, now they have a living tyrant god in the physical plane who can directly interact with everything, who is a lot more disciplined. So Kerioth has now become Lord Akrathil. He's apotheosized into the godhead. And he then reorganizes the wild horde and turns them into the immortal host, which is what the faction is called in the present game. Calth, Inquisitor Calth, the main character in the core box, he is an acolyte of Lord Akrathil. So the immortal host is then morphed from this wild horde of of maniacs into this hyper disciplined, organized, religiously fanatical in many ways, super force. And he starts drawing in other people because the lure that he uses is like, hey, anyone that earns my favor will not die a natural death. They'll defy the Accords because I'll keep giving you Devithae, which an important side effect of Devithae is that it stops you from dying from natural causes and like of aging. So now things have gotten incredibly bad. Lord Akrathil then goes on a systematic march across the world, conquering everyone, destroying nations, coercing factions into serving him, to joining him. And this is when he devises the crawling towers. He's the creator of them. They're actually made from parts of Zenith's body. She cast herself into the mortal plane on the moment of her death to deny all of her power to Hasatan. And then Lord Akrathil devised a way to use some of her remains to create these crawling towers, these monstrosities. And he gifts these to his most powerful viceroys. His viceroys are like his second in commands, so that they can go forth and conquer. On the cusp of total domination, Lord Akrathil mysteriously disappears. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows what happened. At first, everyone was like, oh, he'll be back, because he frequently didn't communicate his plans to his underlings. Because he was on such a different level, literally, that he was playing like 10D chess while even his brightest viceroys were playing maybe 3D chess. Or 4D, excuse me. So he disappears. It causes a lull in the action. And then after a while, people are like, oh, I don't know if he's coming back. Then as, these Devithae addicted viceroys are like, well, hey, he ascended, maybe I can do it. So there starts being some internal conflict. They start turning on each other. They start trying to grab as much Devithae as possible because it is a finite resource. And Belphegor, who is the main antagonist of the core box, he's the brightest. He's the smartest of all. He's the most powerful of all the viceroys. He has a massive Devithae stock. He's been stockpiling it. So he goes to Jasmir, the capital of the nation of Jasmir, which was destroyed at the beginning of the Throne Wars. This is where he believes he can access the Blood Throne. The Blood Throne is a real thing. And he believes that if he can mount the Blood Throne, that he has enough Devithae that he can become an overgod. And that's why we're playing this campaign, right? Like that's why we're here. So Inquisitor Calith has organized everybody that's left to pitch in whatever they can for this final battle to try and stop Belphegor from becoming the new god tyrant that will show no restraint. So I'm sorry, that was a little long-winded, but I love talking about the lore of the game, and I think it's important to kind of set the stage, right? So the army of the Last Accord is comprised of components from every remaining faction on the planet. Groups that may have been enemies previously, set aside their differences to face this existential threat, and have gone forth to siege the Tower of Sacrifice. Belphegor is preoccupied with trying to find his way to the Blood Throne, which exists in a semi-metaphysical state. It's taking all of his resources and attention to try and do that. He has a huge army. The forces of the Last Accord have diverted the majority of his army away from the peninsula. They've bamboozled him. They fooled him. It was Operation Overlord, like in World War II. We pump faked the Nazis, made them think we were going left when we actually went right, and when we stormed Normandy and all those beaches, Juno, etc. So the forces of the Last Accord have done that in the background. So the majority of Belphegor's army is not present. Then the bulk of the army of the Last Accord goes in to start the siege, and they're fighting a token force. But even that is overwhelming. Even that is going to be extremely difficult, and Belphegor's tower is unassailable in the current state. Part of what you do in the game is try to figure out, like, how the heck do we get through the Aegis, like a magical force field that surrounds it, and then actually get into the crawling tower itself, which each tower is different. It's unique to the viceroy that controls it. Belphegor's walks around on like giant spider legs, like giant mechanical spider legs. So it's not even touching the ground, right? Like it's kind of like in Battle Angel Alita, how to get up into the upper world. You have to go up these giant cables where if you do, these giant buzz saws come down and cut you down. So it's not exactly like that, but similar. So when the heroes arrive, the first 2 missions of the game are basically a tutorial. You start out with just 3 heroes, Calth, Downin, and Tatian. And then you get, after you play a very relatively simple mission, which you should play it because it helps you understand how to play the game. It's quick. You then get Amara, Ajax, and Brother Boldstand. You play the second tutorial mission, and then after that, you get 3 more heroes, which I won't spoil it. I don't want to take away too much from you. And then the game opens up into the full campaign at that point. So the way the campaign plays is there's 3 phases, but there's 2 full phases to the game, and there's a 2.5 phase. So you have the strategic phase, which occurs on the campaign map. The campaign map is the peninsula, the Blinded Peninsula, which is what it's called. It's called that because the nation of Jasmir, which was destroyed, their symbol was the eye, the all-seeing eye of Jasmir. It's explained in the lore. It's cool. It's fun. And they call it the Blinded Peninsula now because they've been destroyed, right? Like the eye has been blinded. So this is where the strategic game takes place. Now, before I dive into that, it's important to talk about how you win and lose the campaign. I know I've mentioned this before, but just for completeness, there's one win condition, that's to find a way into the tower and confront and defeat Belphegor. There's 2 lose conditions, and that is if your morale hits 0, that's the morale of the army, or if the campaign clock hits 0. The campaign clock represents the Allied forces' ability to continue to misdirect Belphegor's main army and his allies. If you fail in that, his much, much larger army comes in and steamrolls your siege force. So by winning key missions or plot, we call them plot scenarios, you gain intel and important information and momentum to keep everything going, right? Like as you're winning these key battles, word spreads, more people join you, more people decide, oh, it is worth it to commit to this. So that's how you add time to the campaign clock, because it goes down by 1 every single turn. It's counting towards 0. If it hits 0, you lose. So that explained, once you're through the 2 tutorial scenarios, which again, don't skip them. You need them to rack up XP. Then the game opens up, so to speak. So in the strategic level of the game, the first thing you do is decide, it's base management is what the phase is called, the subphase. So in base management, you decide to begin construction of any new siege camp buildings. So you start out and your siege camp is just a collection of tents, confused soldiers. That's not very organized. No one really knows what's going on. So you start to build base buildings. You can start construction for 1 building per turn. All but one of them are take 1 turn to complete. So if you started on this turn, you get the benefit the next turn. And when I say turn, I mean campaign turn. The only exception to that is the stockade. The stockade is an instant build, and that's for game balance reasons. I'll explain that in a little bit. So each base building requires supplies to be built. Supplies is one of the 3 resources in the game, the other one being gold, and the third being morale, which I've already explained. Gold you use to buy things, like I don't think it requires a lot of explanation. Supplies are what are used to build things in your base. So each building has a certain amount of supplies, and then each building either gives you a benefit or it has an upkeep cost, or both in some instances. And the order in which you build these is really important. It's it's like critical to having success in the game. I'll give you a tip. I always recommend people build the stockade first. Why I suggest this? For one, it's an instant build. It's cheap. It only costs 2 supplies. And it adds morale every turn, right? So it gives you a passive morale bonus. Now, again, at the end of every campaign turn, your morale goes down and the campaign clock goes down. And this is to represent the pressure, the race against time. Like, you're trying to assault the Death Star, right? This is difficult. Not everybody even really think, maybe can we not pull this off? So that's what that mechanic is meant to represent. So right away, you build the stockade. It gives you a morale bonus every single turn passively. It's not very expensive. But most importantly, it can block the raid random event. The raid random event is the worst one. Belphegor's forces send in a raiding party. They blow up one of your buildings. They really lower your morale a ton. It's really bad, right? So you want to avoid that. In playtesting, we did try to build other buildings to give you better passive bonuses first and risk it. And if it works out in your favor, it's great. If it doesn't, it can put you in position to lose the campaign really early. So another example is the blacksmith. The blacksmith when you build it, it generates passive supplies. So every turn, the blacksmith will pump out 1 supply token for you. So obviously that's good. Any of the buildings that give you passive income, obviously the sooner you have them, the more benefit you gain. The blacksmith also allows you to forge items. What that means is one item, like 1 character per turn can have 1 of their items forged at the blacksmith. It costs gold typically to do this. And it's basically lets you upgrade your equipment, right? You can make your sword hit harder, or you can make your armor lighter, or whatever. Every piece of equipment has 2 options. And that's one of the fun things you can do with the blacksmith. Another example is the library. The library is a building you typically will build later in the game. It's expensive and it has an upkeep cost in gold. But what it does is a hero can idle there for a turn. I'll explain that in that section of the podcast. But basically a hero that's not going on a mission can spend a turn in the library researching, ancient knowledge and scrolls. And when they do so, they can unlock a mission that helps you to get legendary items. So there's more options. Obviously, there's 8 buildings total that you can build, but I don't want to spoil it. There's lots of options, put it that way. Once you've decided to start construction on your base or not, maybe you don't have enough supplies to do it. That's really the only reason you wouldn't do it. And buildings can be destroyed as well by the enemy. So sometimes you have to rebuild them. But once you get past that, you then draw from the random event deck. The random event deck is 20 cards. And when your morale is low, you draw 2 and you take the lower number, which is the worst card. But then as your morale goes up, you draw a single card. And then when it gets really high, you draw 2 cards and take the higher card. So in the beginning, it's this uphill battle. It's difficult. And the random events can be really bad. You'll hate it at first, and then it'll become less anxiety inducing as you go, but it's a really, really fun mechanic, and it's meant to represent the fog of war, the chaos of what's going on, to show you there's a battle going on in the background. Once you've resolved that, you go to the campaign map and you look at what missions are currently available to you. The missions that are available to you are represented by reusable stickers that you put on the map, and some missions, when you complete them, will tell you put whatever additional stickers on the map. Frequently this would be, plot missions, the side quests a lot of times won't trigger a new mission, but the sort of like the meat and potatoes, like the core missions typically will. So you can look at the overview page for any of the missions that are on the map, and then you kind of pick which one you want to do. And you can pick from any of the ones that are available that there's a sticker on the map for. Now just bear in mind, the campaign clock is going down every turn. So you do have to attempt the more difficult, we call them plot scenarios, from at fairly regular intervals. Otherwise, you'll lose the campaign. These scenarios are harder, so you want to kind of gear up for them. You want to make sure that you got your A game when you go into those. Once you've selected a scenario to play for that campaign turn, you then go into your hero management to prepare for the battle. So you pick 6 of your heroes, up to 6. You might not, some games you won't have all 6 available to you for a number of reasons. But you take the 6 that you want, up to 6, based on looking at the mission overview, figuring what you need, and then also thinking forward, right? Any hero I take in this mission, if they get knocked out in the mission, they won't be available in the next. If they play 2 missions or scenarios, so I use those words interchangeably. I'm sorry, I don't mean to confuse anybody. They become exhausted and they have to take a break. So there's a risk reward, right? You don't always want to just always spam the same heroes because you may not have them when you need them the most. So you always want to think forward, right? Do I want to risk, my favorite hero in this scenario and not have them available in the next? And then think, okay, when do I need to gear up for one of the more challenging scenarios when I want to make sure I've got all my best heroes? So the way it works is if a hero doesn't participate in a mission, they're automatically back to healthy, good to go. We call it the available status after one campaign turn. So there are 10 plot scenarios. If you have the Gorgontas expansion, there's up to 26 additional scenarios. That's a mix of side quests. And then there are missions that pop up based on what's happening in the game state that you don't have control over, that you have to play. So those will be curveballs that come at you when you don't have a choice. You can't plan for it like you can with the plot scenarios. So once you've determined which scenario you're going to be playing, and for those that pop up that you have to play, you'll know at the end of the current scenario, right? So you'll play the current scenario, and it'll say like on the next campaign turn you must play this. So that's how that is resolved. So once you've picked the mission, picked your squad, you can then go to the merchant if you've built the merchant stall, buy any like healing potions or things of this nature that you want. The merchant has its own item deck. It's called the merchant deck. It's color coded. That's all, I don't want to say mundane, but it's like kind of the stock standard stuff that you're used to. Healing potion, grappling hook, antidote for poison, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go and buy those. If you have any treasure that you found that you don't want, you can sell it to the merchant for gold. So you resolve all that, pick all your special abilities that you want to use for that game. The way it works in reality typically is like once you have it's called your hero deck, which is all your special abilities and items. And it goes into a box. It's color coded for each hero. So it's all easy. It's all very easy to manage it with all the tokens and everything. So for example, let's say you have Ajax the fighter, you pick it up, you open his hero deck, you pull out the cards. You probably already have the ones that you like using. I recommend experimenting with all of them. But if you want to make it easy on yourself, you're like, oh, I'm just going to take the same abilities I did last time and I'm going to buy him a healing potion. Done. It goes really quick. If you have any, magical items that you got from the previous campaign turn or a treasure, you can assign it to heroes at this point in time, and then you go and resolve the tactical campaign. Sorry, the tactical scenario. Now, any heroes that you did not choose to go on the tactical scenario or the mission, they have the option to do what are called idle tasks. So idle tasks are things that heroes are doing when they're not going out and, fighting the bad guys. Usually, if a hero is injured or exhausted, they can't do anything. They have to focus on getting healed up and rested. If a hero does not have one of those states, they can do something useful. Like, for example, the alchemist Jib Job can go into his workshop, his laboratory, and build you and make a potion for you to use in the next campaign turn. Another example is if you've built the barracks in your siege camp, a hero that's not injured or exhausted can go train in the barracks and gain a bunch of XP. So there are a lot of options for things for your heroes to do when they're not playing in a game. I don't want to spoil all of them, and there's more that come up. The options are relatively limited in the early game to keep it from being too complex, and you get more and more as you go. So from there, you play the tactical scenario, you give it your best shot. If you win, you gain morale. If you lose, you lose morale. Regardless if you win or lose, you keep any XP and treasure that you gain in the course of the mission. So if you do fail, you fail forward. The scenarios are not replayable. You get one shot. It's a roguelike, to put it in video game parlance. So the way you get XP, there's two ways to get XP in a mission. There's party EXP, which it comes from adding up all the objectives and monsters you defeated, and then you split that evenly between all the heroes that went on the mission. And then each hero also gets individual XP, which is every turn they survive, they get XP. We did this so that like healers and support characters that don't do a lot of killing didn't just get out-leveled by, the warriors and wizards that are actually killing things. So upon returning to base, you go into the cleanup phase, which is like the 0.5 phase I was talking about. Really, there's the strategic and the tactical level of the game. Cleanup phase is relatively quick. You update hero states. Jib Job got knocked out this time. I need to change his hero state from green to red. Red means injured. You level up any character, any heroes that got enough XP to level up. Choose whatever abilities you want. And again, on their hero sheet, it walks you through the process. It's very straightforward. And you basically just kind of clean everything up. And then the last thing, which I've already mentioned, you lower morale by 2 and you lower the campaign clock by 2. So you want to keep an eye on those two things because those are the lose conditions. If you're like, oh, wow, we only have, 2 morale left. Shoot, like if we lose this mission, we're going to lose the game. But then you might choose to go do a mission that the special benefit is you gain morale, right? Or whatever the case may be, right? Or like, we only have 1 turn left on the campaign clock. We need to go do a plot scenario where we're gonna lose. We're gonna lose the whole kit and caboodle. The leveling process, I'll cover that in a podcast unto itself because that was really, really difficult for a game like this to manage it. And I think what we came up with was really good. It took a long time. But suffice it to say that every level is exciting. There's no dumb. I always hated that, like in 3.5 and D&D, Pathfinder, or any game, is when you would level up and you're like, and you gain HP and that's it. You're like, that wasn't exciting. Now, as I think the new editions of those games, they don't do that anymore. But in the old days, that was always so lame. And we do max out at level 10. All the data I've seen is that pretty much nobody gets up to level 20 or even above level 5 or 6, really. Or it's very uncommon to even go above 10 in most role-playing game campaigns. And as I've stated many times, BloodThrone was designed to be PvP and PvE, so we were designing both of those tracks simultaneously. And the PvE is a blast, right? And it equips you to try PvP if you want to dabble in that. And if you're more of a PvP player, everything that works in PvP will work in PvE. So it's a almost seamless transition. Now, there are some abilities that are better in PvE or PvP, and you'll get a feel for those as you go. But we worked really hard to have as few as possible or no lame duck abilities where you're like, well, I'll never use this in PvP or PvE or whatever the case may be. We wanted all the abilities to feel good for both. And one of the cool side effects of doing it this way is that I believe there is a lot of parity between the classes. Like, one of the things, as I mentioned in the past, that always annoyed me is, like, in a game like, I don't know, Rifts or Pathfinder or Shadowrun or any of the RPGs I loved, there's a massive disparity between, like, some classes are garbage and some are just OP to the moon. And I always hated that. So we worked really hard to make every class feel interesting, powerful, fun, useful. Now, of course, there's going to be some you like more than others. That's natural. But there's a lot of thought, lot of time that went into trying to make them all useful, to make all the options as interesting as we could. But I'm sure there's room for improvement. I hope to get feedback from people when they get the game in their hands and they're playing, because we designed the game to be very easy to update it and make changes. But I think that you'll find that all the options feel cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me on episode 11 of Making the Game from Concept to Kickstarter. BloodThrone is still available on Gamefound. Just search us, BloodThrone, you'll find it. So if you want to back it, you can. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you had a great couple of weeks since the last time I spoke to you. And just as a reminder, I am getting married next week, so I will probably be pretty difficult to get a hold of starting on Monday. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.